secondary sexual characteristics, start growing hair, raise their testosterone, does not explain how body shape happens. You can tell me that you're flooding the organism with all kinds of chemical systems, but you don't say how the change happens. What happens to the microtubules? What happens to the pathways of an organism or a cellular structure and its relationship to its neighbor, given the collective experience that's both inherited and part of the process of growing up? And then I realize again, dear me, I got the ship before the horse. I've been thinking, feeling, conflict, structure. No, I think I got it backwards. I think there's structure. We begin with structure. We begin with a motor act. We begin back in the biotic sea, the biosphere, the early sea, where a group of fat molecules form a string. And then the tide, the molecular tide, the molecular sea, or the actually H2O sea, in its tidal swelling of activity and less activity, closes the circle of the string of fat molecules and forms a membrane. A membrane that's very porous, but a membrane nevertheless. A so-called body wall, creating an inside world in relationship to an outside world. That body wall, that configuration that closes in on itself, forming what will later be a boundary, a body wall, a separate, I should say separate in the sense of a selectively porous membrane that regulates what comes in and out, is a primary motor behavior structure. It is a structure that has learned to replicate itself. It is a structure that is as close, if not in fact, the most early primitive brain. It is a structure that later on in its sophistication of the complexity of evolution, actually, because the skin, the surface, the membrane, the brain, the cortex are growing out of the same embryological layer. And then how it happens to create a secondary pathway of sensing and motor coming out of the same motoric act, you see that complexity grows from the surface inward. From the surface inward, the membrane is regulating the tide of nutrients in the environment and what's leaving the cell. This is a very complicated selection process which has created complex structures. Every single function of the human being is a general pattern in the cellular structure that has a location, a localized specialization. Circulation of the cytoplasmic fluids is in fact a general function, and it has the heart and the blood vessels as a specific location. You get to see now, pulsation, a pulsatory process that's able to change, even though it's within a range, able to make adaptations to the pressure in the environment and the pressure from its own internal metabolism, regulating that pressure, creating very, very complex motoric patterns. Hold still, compress, nothing in, nothing out. Get the heck away from here. Speed up the pulsation so that we can move quickly in spurts like a jellyfish. Go toward, open up and let things in. These are very complex motor acts, which if you become a student of how people are gesticulating, how people are communicating, how people are regulating themselves, and you look at the whole pattern, you'll see very specific, primordial, archetypal movements that are related to the body wall. A way that I generally talk about it is, well, you know, if you think of the body wall, and you think of the body wall doing this, and then all of a sudden, if you think about little flagelli sticking their little hairy tips out to help its little motors to move the bacteria along, and then little flagelli evolving into little limb buds, and little limb buds then evolving into pectoral fins, and pectoral fins becoming wings and arms and hands. You get the idea that when you see people talking and gesticulating and wanting to say things, you begin to see that what is being said is also being reinforced primarily motorically before the words leave the mouth. Let alone that the most developed muscle in the human body happens to be the larynx, because it's the most used muscle in the body. And it's a social muscle. But we never think of speech as a muscular act, but it is. So out of this sort of sea of looking at how an organism develops over time, how an organism goes through a developmental process, which, by the way, I formed 4 stages of a developmental process. The first one I call motility, quick mercurial changes, structures, molecular loose forms, like the ocean, you know. Albert St. Georgi, I don't know how many people know Albert St. Georgi, the molecular biologist, was hired by the oil companies in Alaska to help them understand how a slurry was forming at the edge of the warm oil and the pipe, the oil pipeline, in such a cold environment. And he came to 2 simple conclusions. Pressure at a surface creates form. Pressure at a surface generates a coalescing or a compression of molecular structure, forming different solids from within the liquid form itself. So that you see that when you're talking about form, human form, you're talking about a form that's capable of being gaseous, capable of being a semi-gel, capable of being ice, a thick substance, capable of going back and forth, depending upon temperature and activity. Think about forming structures in a body. Think about surface membranes. Think about waves of pulsations traveling through a very complex set of structures, changing amplitude, changing intensity over time, and you see structures coming into existence. The human being, going through its motile, very changeable structures, you certainly see that embryologically in those first weeks. I mean, this is a panorama of evolutionary shapes appearing right in front of your nose at a rapid speed. And that this is before real proliferation takes place, which adds body weight then to the same structures. You have a completely different organizational influx there during this motile stage. The second stage of a development, you could say that the first stage could be a chemical signal. It could be a genetic time clock. It could be radiation coming from a solar storm. Whatever, you get quick changes, an inflammatory-like process that as it accumulates a structure over time, it becomes less motile and more porous. It becomes more selective or has some duration that it can contain its structure before it disappears again into the previous shape. So that you get structures that begin to be very unformed, but have enough form to sustain themselves over time. And then as you get an increase in protein metabolism, you get structural solidity, you get a rigid state, you get more duration, you get predictable motor attitude, and then you get habituation or compressed architecture or cellular colonies that form groups of behavior. Those are the 4 stages, and by the way, those 4 stages are what every single patient goes through, whether you put your hands on them or you're doing effective psychotherapy. There will be the flashes of insight, the mercurial dreams, the flash of emotion, that in the retelling and trying to recapture it, they slip away and then you edit it, and if you maintain the intensity of the act of trying to say it or repeat it, you begin to trigger in the nucleus protein metabolism, and you have axon growth, change in body mass, change in relationship. People go through this. And you can see where in the process they are in the beginning electrifying stages, in the stages where they can hold it and can't hold it, in the stages where it's beginning to be solid, in the stages where it has solidity. People don't know this. I found that wonderful healers, people who really help people, run into difficulties they don't understand. Well, why don't they hold the insight? Why don't they hold the acupuncture points stimulation? Why is it that I release the structural difficulties? Why doesn't it hold together? And I realized they don't really understand that there's a developmental process for a shape to change form over time. And that we neglect, well, I certainly did until I found out, how is it that you support a growing process? Well, this is quite another little story about how structure supports itself. One of the wonderful things about an embodied animate structure that is capable of replicating its own shape, generating it by itself, regulates its own process. Without self-regulation, which is an autonomous process, many of us would not be around. You know, the input of a thyroxine or adrenaline is not a pharmacist metering out exact grams of a charge. There's an increase in production, which could be lesser or more than needed, and then an adaptation and a regulation of it, what has to happen. This self-regulation process is an inherited process. But in many cases, self-regulation, escape mechanisms, fight mechanisms, adrenalization, stepping up of metabolic processes, the innate process is not enough. It misses the mark, or there's structural dilemmas. We see this, say, in depressive people who have a low serotonin uptake. Or you could see it in a thyroid situation, or many other situations, or people who have low back pains who really, no matter how much exercise they do, they don't really understand how to support it, and the body, while it tries to recover from the inflammatory event, has no way of changing its structure. So in this long process of evolution, self-regulation, involuntary regulation, becomes voluntary regulation. The supreme organ of voluntary regulation happens to be the cortex, not only in its prefrontal planning area, but also in its motor strip, in which it's able to differentiate qualities and quantities of muscular tonus, altering shape. It makes the difference between being irritated and outraged. It makes the difference between helping a person understand that the organizational to defend yourself is an all or nothing thing that could be regulated by the cortex to become softer, less tonus, and rage becomes anger, and anger becomes annoyance. So that you see that the organism has within it a growing function to regulate its own behavior, first involuntarily, and then through voluntary effort. Voluntary muscular effort, and the organism has a direct relationship with its own body walls, muscular reflex inherited behaviors, which it is able to change the intensity and the amplitude of the action in process, giving birth to new sensations, new ways of, through sensation, recognizing the pattern and the pattern mapping in the cortex of an action, altering the intensity of the pattern, altering the intent of the pattern, creating a new set of neural maps which are interacting with the old maps, creating a new synaptic mass, new way of behaving, and altered behavior. I'm running past through this. Hopefully I'm not leaving too many lacuna. That process of the emergence, it's an emergent function of voluntary muscular action, voluntary muscular regulation, built out of the involuntary muscular regulation, starting at the cell boundary or wall, is an emergent human function which has permitted the growth of a particularized human being, a human being capable of altering